Remembrance Day. Well, it's only one year in seven, of course, that Remembrance Day falls on a Sunday. Well, what is it? Where does it come from? Well, on the 11th of November 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the armistice took effect. So an armistice is a temporary halt in fighting whilst the long-term peace is negotiated. It was the end of the First World War, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That's just by coincidence. So we now have the expression at the 11th hour, as in at the very last minute, something happens, some catastrophe is avoided. So the First World War was over, or so it seemed. People weren't quite certain, because then the Paris peace treaties were negotiated over the next few months with Germany, over the next couple of years with the other countries on Germany's side, such as Austria and Bulgaria. So people thought fighting might break out again. But nonetheless, there was the most enormous outbreak of celebration. People were jubilant within the Allied side that they'd won the war. Even on the Central Powers side, some people were relieved. They had at least survived. At least 16 million people had been killed over the previous 4 years. And in Europe, it was the bloodiest war of all time. There were other wars in other zones of the world, such as the Taiping Rebellion, which claimed more lives. People were so malnourished at the end of the First World War. Many of them died of Spanish influenza over the next year or so. They were debilitated from not having enough to eat. There was a lack of medicine, a lack of fuel, a lack of means of transport, just about everything. So Remembrance Day is something that's really celebrated in the United Kingdom, obviously, well, commemorated, I should say. Other countries, France, Germany, the United States, they all have their own way of doing it. So I'm looking principally about how it's marked in the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth countries. So about 800,000 British servicemen were killed, about 100,000 British civilians, about 300,000 Commonwealth soldiers and sailors were killed, and some civilians as well. It wasn't the bloodiest war that the United Kingdom had ever fought. Going back to even before the UK existed, if you look at the English Civil War, there's a higher proportion of the English population were killed in that. In Ireland, that war killed an even higher proportion of our population than the English Civil War did. But nevertheless, this is a war that really stands out in the mind. A media war. A war was actually filmed for the first time. Occasionally combat sequences filmed without sound, but nevertheless, they were moving images. And there were plenty of cameras around by that time. So for the first few years, of course, the 11th of November didn't happen to fall on a Sunday. People began to distinguish between the two. The 11th of November, a day for wild rejoicing. They were maffacking, as they would have said at the time, because they were so elated that the Allies had won. It hadn't all been for nothing. They hadn't been conquered by the enemy. Their way of life had not been destroyed. But also, the nearest Sunday to the 11th was a poignant moment for recalling fallen friends and relatives. And as Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, said at the time, every table had its empty place. It was most families had at least someone, even if a second-degree relative, who had been killed in the war. There were a handful of thankful villages in the United Kingdom, a village where nobody got killed. Anyway, eventually the memorialism started. Cenotaphs built all over the country. There's the Cenotaph in London, on Whitehall, in between Parliament and Downing Street, means empty tomb in ancient Greek, because it does look like a memorial tomb, very high, but obviously there's no body in it. Sir Edward Landseer Lutyens, the United Kingdom's most celebrated architect of the early 20th century, he designed it. And so there was a Canadian doctor, John McCrae, who served in the Canadian Army, who wrote his celebrated poem. I can't quite remember the words, not correctly, saying, we are the dead, here we lie beneath the sky with the poppies row and row. So they throw forward the torch of the new generation in Flanders fields. It begins in Flanders fields, Flanders being northern Belgium, and poppies naturally grow there. So many men were killed, buried where they fell. Poppies were to be nourished by their corpses. And so that's why around this time of year, people in the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth countries, some of them wear poppies, red poppies in their lapel, and they donate money for that, which raises money for the Poppy Appeal, so that's called the Earl Haig Fund. Douglas Haig was a British field marshal, commanded the Battle of the Somme and so on, and he set this up after the war as a way of raising money for widows, for orphans, for disabled soldiers. There are many soldiers who'd gone to war as teenagers. These soldiers and sailors, even those who'd survived, some of them had been blinded, they'd been deafened, they'd had their limbs blown off, they'd had a bullet in the spine, paralysed from the neck down, or suffered the most horrific burns. Many of them were shell-shocked, had post-traumatic stress disorder. So many of them suffered for the rest of their lives. So to raise money to help these poor disabled soldiers and their families. So the next year, 1919, on the 10th of November that year, an unidentified British corpse from a French battlefield was brought to London Victoria Station by train. For the dead man's uniform, they could identify that he was British, but they couldn't identify him because there were tens of thousands of soldiers who were so blown beyond recognition they couldn't tell, the face blown off or just the corpse wasn't found for months, by which time the person had rotted away. There were no letters or personal effects to identify the name, no dog tags in those days. So there were tens of thousands of soldiers with no known grave. Sometimes the bodies were found and just buried with the words on the headstone, "A soldier of the Great War, known unto God." Sometimes they could identify the nationality, others not, because the uniform had been rotten away. So many British families had no grave for their stricken relative. So it was decided they would take an unidentified cadaver, accord him the singular honour of a state funeral, and bury him with full pomp in Westminster Abbey. So King George V opposed this because he said you're going to bury it in the middle of the aisle of Westminster Abbey, the most historic church in the United Kingdom, the Valhalla of the country. So many kings and queens interred there. But the Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, he officially advised the King that the unknown soldier must be interred there. His Gracious Majesty reluctantly bowed to the Prime Ministerial advice. And so on the 11th of November 1919, a year after the end of the war, this body, the unknown soldier, was borne on a bier to a gun carriage, and then horses drew it to Westminster Abbey, and he's buried with the highest ceremonial. So any family whose relative had no known grave could imagine this was their person. Okay, if your relative hadn't been serving at that particular battlefield, you know it couldn't have been him. And there are many sailors who had no grave but the sea. So there's a tomb of the unknown soldier in France, in Russia, in India, in the United States, many other countries, in eternal flame in many countries too. So in late October, poppies go on sale in the United Kingdom and overseas. They're made of red paper with a bit of green plastic like the stem. People just donate for those. The poppy factories in Richmond upon Thames in London. If you look carefully on the black bit of the poppy, it'll say Earl Haig Fund. I've got a bit of John McCrae's words here from In Flanders Fields. "We are the dead. In Flanders fields where we lie, grow the poppies, row on row, beneath the sky." And anyway, it goes on. So the poppy symbol adopted by Earl Haig. And Douglas Haig, as he was, he refused to accept an earldom, this noble title, until enough was done for the ex-serviceman. I know he's now execrated as being a butcher, as being a donkey, just mutton-headed and uncaring. Others say, no, he cared deeply about his men. He knew that wars could not be won by sentimentality. There was no way to win without very heavy casualties, and you just had to face it. People slammed him for not visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals enough, but his staff saw the effect it had on him. It made him shrink from his duty when he had to face up to these young soldiers, these adolescents in many cases, who were scarred for life, disabled for life. So you just had to put that on your mind and go for it, because if you're too upset by these things, you'll never win. He was given a task and he completed his mission successfully, and there was an appalling human cost. Should there be negotiation? Well, that was a political decision, not his to make. Anyway, so the Earl Haig Fund, as I said, commonly called the Poppy Appeal, raises funds for ex-soldiers, servicemen, well, servicewomen too. Remembrance Sunday, well, some people call it Poppy Day. So we now really commemorate it on the nearest Sunday to the 11th, not so much on the 11th itself. The night before Remembrance Sunday, there'll be a Royal Festival of Remembrance, and it's held at Royal Albert Hall in London. The Chelsea pensioners march in and have pride of place. These are old soldiers and sailors. They can only be bachelors or widowers, and they retire to the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. It's not really a hospital, it's a retirement home, and they wear their very distinctive scarlet coats and black hats and trousers. So the celebration takes place in the presence of Her Britannic Majesty, and though it is to some extent a sombre occasion, there's also jollity, there's plenty of music and comedy. There's a fundraiser for the Poppy Appeal. The performers all do it gratis because every penny is for this worthy cause. So the Cenotaph, the various dignitaries will be there, the High Commissioners of all the Commonwealth countries, and Her Majesty the Queen, the Prime Minister, and the leaders of all the political parties are represented in Westminster, and indeed the Bishop of London, whichever army officers commanding London district, they're all there in their finest outfits. The politicians often wear dark suits, usually not black ties, I don't think. And Michael Foot, who was the leader of the opposition, a Labour politician way back in 1981, he wore a donkey jacket and people were irate, spitting at the screen. They felt it was disrespectful that he wasn't in morning dress. So the Cenotaph is the focal point for the commemorations on Remembrance Sunday. And then a gun goes off at Horse Guards Parade, as in artillery piece, at 11 o'clock exactly. It'll be the same time as Big Ben chimes 11. And that's it. The 2-minute silence begins. And then after that, the bugle plays the last post, which they play at a funeral. So then the Queen lays a wreath and various other dignitaries in order lay wreaths, other members of the royal family, and they'll be in military uniform if they're in the military, and the Prime Minister, followed by the leader of the opposition, followed by the other parties in order of size, and all the Commonwealth High Commissioners. And then there's a march past of veterans in uniforms, or kind of the veterans' version of a uniform, thousands of them, and they're more cheerful tunes. There'll be more reflective ones, contemplative ones beforehand, like playing, what's it called, Nimrod, for instance. Or there'll be hymns, there'll be a short service led by the Bishop of London before this joyous march past, often playing Abide With Me. So old-timers, ones which are more plaintive. So the foot guards will be there, might be a different regiment of foot guards each time. You know the soldiers outside Buckingham Palace, they're wearing the red tunics in the summer, the black bearskin hats, but it being winter they'll wear their grey greatcoats over, and they'll be providing the live music. So that's that. The dignitaries are waiting in the Foreign Office beforehand. They only go out a few minutes beforehand. And junior members of the House of Windsor watch from the balcony above there. When it comes to the upboat, the march past, they'll start with the band playing God Save the Queen before they go into the up-tempo music and mark the cheerier part of the ceremony. The whole thing's over by 12 noon. It's shown live on BBC. I've been there certainly once, 2003, was it another time, at Remembrance Day. Or was it twice? I think it was there in 99. So other countries mark Remembrance Day around this time. Veterans Day in the United States, the Germans mark it, but it's more downbeat because, of course, they lost these world wars. So the distinction between Remembrance Sunday and Remembrance Day has been lost now, as I said. So that's that. And many towns around the United Kingdom and abroad have a cenotaph with the names of the fallen etched there and the words, their name liveth forevermore, or dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It was Wilfred Owen, or was it Rupert Brooke? I think Owen, who mocked that in his very acerbic poem, Dulce et decorum est. Right, that's enough about Remembrance Day.